Today we're going to talk about World War II. So if you'd like to follow along, this is just America and World War II PowerPoint. According to John Keegan, World War II was the largest single event in human history, fought across 6 of the world's 7 continents and all of its oceans. It killed 50 million human beings, left hundreds of millions of others wounded in mind or body, and materially devastated much of the heartland of civilization. John Keegan is a real famous military historian. If you really like the military history of World War II and World War One, he has good books you should check out. So World War II is going to begin in 1931, 37. If you're talking about the war in Asia, it begins in Europe in 1939, and then it ends in 1945 when the United States drops the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's kind of what we're going to do, talk about the road to war, and then we'll actually get to the war. The road to war corresponded with the rise of fascism in Europe and Asia. Benito Mussolini of Italy came to power in 1922. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. And then Hideki Tojo came to power in 1941 in Japan, although he had played a role in the military prior to that date. Mussolini founded the Fascist Party in Italy. He had been a World War I veteran. He'd been a socialist for a while, and then he founded the Fascist Party. He marched on Rome in 1922 and seized power. He famously said, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That kind of sums up fascism, no individual liberty. The one thing fascism, Nazism, communism, socialism kind of all have in common is no respect for individual rights. Slowly over time in the 1920s, he gained power, created a one-party state in Italy. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia. He wanted to basically make the Mediterranean see the lake of Italy again. He kind of wanted to reestablish the glory days of Rome. So he invades Ethiopia to get colonies for Italy. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations for help, but they responded only with condemnation of Mussolini's aggression and limited sanctions. They didn't really do anything to stop him. Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, but he had been doing stuff in Germany in the 1920s. He also was a World War I veteran wounded by gas. In 1923, he tried to take over part of Germany in the Beer Hall Putsch. This failed. He tried to seize power. He's arrested and put in prison, but it was a reduced sentence. He really didn't serve a real prison sentence. He could receive visitors. Prison was kind of a nice place for Hitler during this time. During this time, he wrote Mein Kampf, which is My Struggle. That was his kind of book talking about what he planned to do with Germany. In it, he rails against the Versailles Treaty. He talks about wanting to reunite Germans who had been moved to other countries or parts of Germany that had been lopped off and given to other countries. He also wanted to conquer Eastern Europe and use their rich soil, their agricultural produce to kind of grow Germany. This is what he called Lebensraum, living space. He comes to power, like I said, in 1933, mostly because the Great Depression kind of helped catapult him into power. If you look at slide 5, I've got a list of the Versailles Treaty stipulations against Germany. He basically undoes all of these. Now, before Hitler, the Kaiser had abdicated during World War I. Something called the Weimar Republic is established. It's a democratic constitutional government in Germany, but it's politically and economically weak. It falls behind on its reparations, their payments towards France. So France occupies the industrially rich Ruhr Valley in Germany to basically get their money. German workers go on strike. The whole country of Germany, the Weimar government rallies around the workers. The Weimar government prints money to pay the workers. Wages go up by the billions because of inflation. You can see people wheelbarrowing money around, children playing with millions of Deutschmarks, the German currency. So basically, the weakness of the Weimar Republic helped catapult Hitler to power also with the Great Depression. In 1935, Hitler rearmed. You weren't supposed to do that according to the Versailles Treaty. In 1936, he marches into the Rhineland, which was supposed to remain demilitarized. In 1936, he also signed the Rome-Berlin Axis with Italy, and then the Anti-Comintern Pact. Italy, Germany, and Japan kind of signed this anti-communist alliance with each other. In 1938, something called the Anschluss happened. Germany invades Austria and unites the two nations together. That wasn't supposed to happen according to Versailles. In 1938, you have the Munich Conference later on that year. Basically, Hitler wanted something called the Sudetenland. This was part of Czechoslovakia that had a majority German population, but because of World War I, that part had been given to Czechoslovakia, so Hitler wants that back. What ends up happening is Britain and France and some other nations in Europe have a conference in Munich, and basically they give in to Hitler's demands. Hitler says, if you give me the Sudetenland, I have no more, wishes to annex any parts of Europe. So basically the British and the French think that they've saved Europe by giving in to Hitler. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously says, I have peace in our time. If you watch the YouTube clip, you can see him talking about that. So he believes that through appeasement, he has prevented another great war. Churchill famously said after the Munich conference, Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They will have war. In August 1939, Hitler signs the Non-Aggression Pact with Stalin. Basically, Nazism and communism, they were bitter enemies. Even though they're both totalitarian, they both have a lot in common. They don't respect individual rights, but they agree not to attack each other. They also agree to carve up Poland. Part of the reason Stalin did this is because he believed the Western democracies, Britain and France, were not going to stand up to Hitler. So basically, I better make a deal with Hitler because nobody's going to stand up to him, and the Soviet Union's not strong enough to do that yet. So they invade, or they carve up Poland, and what ends up happening is Hitler invades Poland September 1st, 1939. This is the start of World War II in Europe. He invades with a tactic known as Blitzkrieg. That just means lightning war. Basically, he uses tanks and airplanes to just invade a country so quickly, it's like you chop off the head and then the body's kind of lifeless. So a lot of times they'll invade behind enemy lines with the tanks and the airplanes, cut off all communication to the front lines, and then just surround the armies as they do that. When Poland is invaded, this is finally what causes Britain and France to declare war, and World War II starts in Europe. So basically, everything that the Versailles Treaty accomplished or forced on Germany, Hitler is able to do away with. Later on, Hitler, after he conquers Poland, he's kind of finished in the east for now. He goes and conquers Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Germany, Great Britain, and France don't fight for a while, but then in May of 1940, Germany invades France, and by June of 1940, France falls. So Hitler has conquered Eastern and Western Europe, and because he's allied with Italy, he also controls, through his alliance, Italy. So basically, most of Europe is under Nazi control. Great Britain is the last remaining great democracy left to fight the Nazis. So that's going on. So I kind of want to backtrack and talk a little bit about what America is doing at this time. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson broke off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. The Bolshevik government refused to pay off debts to Americans. The Bolsheviks ignored treaty obligations with other nations. The Bolsheviks had seized American property in Russia. So basically, there's not good relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. And Wilson had sent troops in to help the Red Army or the White Army crush the Reds. So he had tried to help the anti-communists. Fast forward to 1933, FDR realizes that you can't ignore a big, powerful country forever, so he decides that the United States, should recognize the Soviet Union. He thought this would help limit Japanese expansion in Asia, because traditionally Japan and Russia had been enemies. This also would help American commercial interests. And America is basically the only major country that has not yet recognized the Soviet Union. So he ends up recognizing the Soviet Union. FDR initiates something called the Good Neighbor Policy. Basically, he says, in the past, America has acted aggressively towards Central and South America, kind of Latin America. So we are no longer going to do that. We'll use cooperation instead of military intervention if we ever want to deal with somebody in Latin America. He repudiates Wilson's previous intervention in Latin America. The U.S. Congress repudiates the Platt Amendment that said the United States could always intervene in Cuban affairs. FDR said the definite policy of the United States from now on is one opposed to armed intervention. Okay, so America is basically going to be more isolationist during the 20s and the 30s. We don't, the United States does not want to be dragged into another European war. But FDR knows that that's maybe not the best thing. He says, this nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. He knows that this isn't like World War I when there wasn't really a bad, evil country. Everyone was kind of fighting, but nobody was morally reprehensible like Hitler was. He knows that things are different now that World War II is here. Another thing that helped Americans stay isolationist was something called the Merchants of Death. After World War I, a lot of Americans started to believe that it had been a mistake to enter World War I. They blamed bankers, munition traders, and European business interests. I'll get to the Nye Committee in a minute, but America is also in the middle of the Great Depression, so most Americans are concerned with domestic matters, not international matters. FDR said, there are some among us who close their eyes honestly and sincerely, thinking that the many hundreds of miles of salt water made the American hemisphere so remote that the people of North and Central and South America could go on living in the midst of their vast resources without reference to or danger from other continents of the world. But the American public's not going to have any of it. One of the reasons I said the Merchants of Death, that kind of came from the Nye Committee. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota had these hearings in the 1930s. Basically, he investigated the profits of munition manufacturers during World War I. He's kind of said the Merchants of Death and the pursuit for war profits dragged the United States into war. America has to keep a very close eye on these troublemakers during the 1930s, these people that want to get us back into a European war. There's even a book called The Merchants of Death that's published, and it kind of echoes some of the things the Nye Committee said. Now, while all this aggression is going on in Europe, the American Congress kind of echoes the public sentiment of isolationism. So they passed a series of neutrality acts. I'll let you read what each one of those do, but there's a Neutrality Act in 1935, in 1936, in 1937. Basically, the goal is to keep America out of a European war. So these neutrality acts have different parts of them, but basically that's the main goal. There's another one in 1939. It's just meant to keep us out of the war. Although once you start getting closer and closer to the European war actually starting, the Neutrality Acts start to kind of get a little bit more permissive in what they allow Americans to do. But like I said, they want to keep America out of war. Groups formed to stop American intervention in Europe. There's a large group called the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh is kind of its most famous speaker. Basically, they say, stay out of European affairs, listen to George Washington and the Founding Fathers, what they talked about early on. We don't want to be involved in all this stuff. But FDR knows that he believes that eventually America cannot stay neutral forever. He does a lot of things that Wilson failed to do. FDR brings Republicans into the administration because he knows he needs a bipartisan support when the war does start. So Henry Stimson and Frank Knox become secretaries of the War and the Navy. They were both Republicans. In the summer of 1940, FDR exchanges 50 World War I era destroyers for British bases. So basically, the British give up some of their their naval bases in return for these ships that we give to Great Britain. Congress approves a large increase in defense spending in October 1940. You have the first peacetime draft registration and conscription in American history. So America is kind of becoming military prepared for war, even though most Americans want to stay out of the war. In 1940, there's another election. FDR runs against Wendell Willkie. FDR wins again pretty handily. This is FDR's third term. A lot of Americans thought you should not run for a third term because George Washington set the precedent that you should only serve 2 times as president. But FDR believes that America is facing such crisis with the Great Depression and World War II that he has to run again. And more Americans agreed with him than with the idea that you should not have a third term, so he wins pretty easily again. In his third term, his inaugural address, he gives a famous speech where he talks about the 4 freedoms: the freedom of speech, religion, the freedom from want, the freedom from fear. He even talked about a new Bill of Rights that was more of an economic Bill of Rights, that you shouldn't ever have to worry about a job or where to live or stuff like that. Another thing FDR does foreign policy-wise is the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. Basically, Britain can't pay cash for any military supplies, so FDR says that we'll lend or lease military equipment, and basically you'll give that back when the war's done. He famously says if your neighbor's house is on fire, you loan him your garden hose so he can put the fire out, and when the fire's out, he gives you back the hose. But the difference here is that when you loan planes or tanks or ships or whatever, guns to another country to fight a war, you're obviously not going to get those back because things get destroyed in war. So one of the things that ends up happening in Europe in 1941 is Hitler has defeated France. He's neutralized England. He decides to break the non-aggression pact and attack the Soviet Union. So he does this in June of 1941. It's called Operation Barbarossa. 3 million Germans invade, 2.5 million Russians die. Germans advance until the Russian winter sets in. The Germans got right on the outskirts of Moscow and almost took Moscow, but the Russians defended it, and the winter helped them, so the Germans don't quite capture Moscow. In the fall of 1941, FDR meets Winston Churchill in the Atlantic. They have this Atlantic Charter meeting. Basically, it's a joint declaration outlining the broad principles of the war of Great Britain and the United States. So even though America's not in the war yet, FDR says if the war does come, here's what it should be fought over. You'll read some of this, but it's actually kind of echoes Wilson's 14 points, so you can find some of this stuff in Wilson's 14 points. FDR also orders the American Navy to attack German submarines in the Atlantic. So there is a war going on. Basically. So, okay, so that's kind of stuff going on in Europe. I'm going to switch now to Asia. We're going to backtrack a little bit. Japan becomes an imperialist power in the 1890s, early 1900s. Japan had fought with the Allies during World War I, but then at the peace conference, basically Japan took a back seat. Japan thought they should get colonies like the rest of the European powers. They don't really. They get some, but not what they thought. So Japan basically feels like they've been mistreated after the Versailles conference. They get a smaller share of colonies. They get lesser status as a nation. There's also some racial tensions because they don't feel like they're being recognized as an equal to the European nations because of their Asian race. So Japan feels upset. And Japan also knew that eventually they might have to fight the United States or Russia because they've always kind of had problems with Russia. They're right next to each other. But also, the United States and Japan share the Pacific, so they worried about that. At the Washington Naval Conference in 1921, 1922, basically the great powers sign a pledge to limit the capacity of their navies. There's this ratio of 5 to 3, so America and Britain have the same tonnage of shipping, but Japan gets a less tonnage. Japan saw this as unfair. Japan also went through the Great Depression. Japan has trouble feeding itself because it's an island. There's not a lot of places to grow food. Stuff that Japan exports all of a sudden is cut off. So basically, what is Japan supposed to do? They decide that they need living space in China. So they're going to invade China coming up. And you'll kind of watch some of this when you watch the videos on the road to war. Hideki Tojo is kind of the mastermind, I guess you could say, behind the Japanese military kind of aggression. He's the Minister of War in 1940, the Prime Minister in 1941. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. In 1937, they invade China proper. And then in July 1941, they invade Indochina. So you can kind of see on the map on slide 65 all the different places they invade. FDR suggests a quarantine against Japan. Basically, that's how he wants to deal with it. You know, we can't go to war against Japan, but let's quarantine them like you would a sick person. Let's cut them off from the civilized nations of the world. America also cuts off their oil, gasoline, metal, things they need to use to make war. There's an incident in 1931 called the Mukden incident. You'll kind of watch this. Basically, what happens is Japan attacks a railway station in Manchuria and blames the Chinese, and this is a pretext for invasion. Basically, the League of Nations investigates, but they do nothing. The United States passes something called the Stimson Doctrine. Basically, the U.S. won't recognize this new government set up in China that's controlled by the Japanese. So America doesn't want to help with this aggression. They want to find a way to oppose it. So after all this invasion, FDR kind of doesn't know what to do, so he just does the quarantine speech. You have something called the Panay incident.